A single father boards a routine flight, exhausted and anxious about returning home to his young daughter. What begins as a mundane journey soon spirals into a test of courage, skill, and human connection that no parent or passenger could ever anticipate. James shuffled down the narrow aisle of the plane, the soft hum of the engines already vibrating through the cabin. His shoulders ached from the weight of his backpack and the constant pressure of life's demands. Being a single father was exhausting in ways that no job description could capture. Between work, bills, and bedtime routines, he felt like he was sprinting a marathon every single day. Tonight, he wanted nothing more than the solace of a seat in row 10, the brief illusion of being alone, if only for a few hours. The stewardess greeted him with a polite smile, and he nodded, distracted, too tired to muster a proper response. He placed his bag overhead and sank into the seat, letting out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The fabric smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old upholstery, but to James, it was the closest thing to a temporary haven he could find in the air. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of Lily. She was 8, with a stubborn streak and a laugh that could pierce through even the darkest days. She was probably at home, waiting for him to finish his trip, her homework scattered on the kitchen table, her small hands gripping a crayon as she tried to replicate shapes he wouldn't get to see. He felt a pang of guilt. He hated that his work often kept him away, that he missed her bedtime stories more often than he liked to admit. "I'll make it up to you," he whispered quietly, not to anyone but himself, hoping the words would reach her across the miles. The cabin was dim, passengers settling in with their routines. Some read quietly, faces illuminated by the soft glow of their devices. Others whispered to companions or glanced anxiously out the windows, gripping armrests as if the thin walls could keep the sky from betraying them. James watched them in silence, noting the subtle tension and fragility, the tiny gestures of human vulnerability. He understood those looks. Everyone carried something: worry, sadness, hope, fear, hidden behind polite smiles and restrained conversation. Here, in this small floating vessel, everyone was temporarily equal, all suspended together, all relying on forces beyond their control. A young couple in the row ahead whispered back and forth, laughter punctuating the low murmur of their conversation. James allowed himself a faint smile. He remembered holding Lily close, reading her the same silly rhymes over and over, trying to coax giggles from her tired little body. Life felt like a series of fleeting moments strung together, some sweet, some painful, all slipping by too quickly. He closed his eyes, imagining her tiny face, the way she scrunched her nose when she was concentrating, the way her hair fell messily across her forehead as she dozed off after a long day. That image kept him tethered, a small anchor in the midst of exhaustion. The flight attendants moved along the aisle, checking seat belts, offering drinks, quietly balancing professionalism and warmth. James nodded at one of them, a young woman with empathetic eyes, and she gave him a quick, understanding smile. He imagined her noticing the exhaustion etched into his face, recognizing it as a familiar story. Someone carrying more than they should, someone clinging to fragments of normalcy. He felt a flicker of gratitude, fleeting but comforting. In that moment, it felt as if the cabin had slowed. The usual hustle softened, allowing him a brief window to breathe. A small child a few rows back began to cry, piercing through the soft hum like an alarm. Parents scrambled, whispered reassurances, tumbling over each other, hands trying to soothe, distract, comfort. James winced, sympathetic, remembering nights spent trying to calm Lily when nightmares clutched her small body. When tears were her only language, he closed his eyes again, imagining holding her close, feeling her heartbeat slow against his chest, her fears melting away under the warmth of his presence. The memory was bittersweet, a reminder of both love and the distance his work sometimes created. Minutes passed, stretching into hours. James drifted in and out of light sleep, the plane's subtle sway lulling him, while the constant pressure in his ears reminded him of the altitude. His mind wandered to the mundane and the profound simultaneously. Bills that needed paying, emails waiting to be answered, the small victories of Lily learning to ride her bike without training wheels. He felt a tension between the exhaustion that weighed on him and the unrelenting sense of duty he carried. He was always on, always responsible, always the one who had to figure things out. Tonight, in this quiet, dimly lit space, he allowed himself to acknowledge that weariness fully, embracing it without shame. A soft chime drew his attention. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured. James listened, half drifting in and half alert. The routine updates about weather, altitude, and estimated arrival times felt comforting in their predictability. Yet beneath that calm surface, James sensed the latent tension that always lingered in the air above the clouds, the invisible risks that made even ordinary flights moments of fragile trust. He imagined himself navigating the invisible currents, a single father responsible for someone's tiny life below, and felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The hours in row 10 were a strange blend of peace and underlying tension. James' attention flickered between sleep and observation, internal reflection and external awareness. Conversations floated past him, fragments of human experience. A hushed argument over seating, the nervous laughter of a first-time traveler, the quiet sigh of an elderly man leaning on his cane. Each tiny story added to the mosaic of the cabin, the shared human experience of vulnerability and hope, and James felt both part of it and a part, an observer and a participant at once, as the plane continued its steady climb through the night sky. James felt the weight of anticipation settle in his chest. He didn't know it yet, but the night would demand more than his patience, more than his exhaustion. It would call upon skills, instincts, and courage buried beneath the ordinary struggles of life. For now, though, he focused on what he could hold close, the image of Lily, her small hand gripping his, the sound of her laugh, the warmth of her presence. That small, steadfast image anchored him in the present, a tether to the world below as he drifted between vigilance and rest. And then, just as his eyelids began to droop into deeper sleep, the captain's voice pierced the quiet once more. "Is there a fighter pilot on board?" The question was calm, but something in its tone made James sit up straight, pulse quickening. It was sudden, unexpected, the hinge between ordinary and extraordinary, and he felt a rush of fear and responsibility that instantly shattered the fragile peace. For the first time in hours, he was fully awake, heart pounding, mind racing, and he realized that tonight nothing would be routine again. The sudden question echoed in the cabin, lingering like an electric charge in the air. Passengers exchanged confused glances, some murmuring nervously, others stiffening with a mix of curiosity and fear. James' heart pounded in his chest. Fighter pilot? The words felt impossibly surreal in the midst of his exhausted, ordinary life. He tried to steady his breathing, reminding himself that this wasn't a drill, that the stakes were real. His eyes darted toward the cockpit door, the source of the captain's voice, and he felt the old adrenaline start to tingle through his veins, a reminder of skills he hadn't used in years, memories of training, maneuvers, and split-second decisions resurfaced, mingling with the weight of responsibility he felt as a father. If he didn't act, he knew the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for him, but for the dozens of lives suspended in the narrow metal tube above the clouds. The plane shuddered, subtle at first, then with increasing intensity. The overhead lights flickered, throwing shadows across the anxious faces of passengers. Someone gasped, gripping the armrest so tightly that their knuckles turned white. The hum of the engines grew uneven, a discordant vibration that made James' stomach tighten. Panic started to ripple through the cabin, a living thing that moved from person to person, each heartbeat amplifying the next. Parents whispered reassurances to children who clung desperately to stuffed animals or the edges of their seats. James' gaze fell to his hands, and for a moment, he felt paralyzed, caught between fear and instinct. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her face taut with controlled urgency, attempting to calm passengers while simultaneously communicating with the cockpit. Her voice was a fragile thread of composure, fragile against the rising chaos. James realized that the thread could snap at any moment, and if it did, no one else could step in. He swallowed hard, the taste of adrenaline sharp in his mouth, and raised his hand almost instinctively. The murmurs around him grew louder, passengers noticing, some hopeful, some incredulous. "I have experience," he said, voice low but steady. The words felt heavier than anything he had ever spoken, carrying the weight of years he thought he had left behind. A tense silence followed, broken only by the subtle groan of the plane as it navigated the turbulent sky. The captain's voice returned, a mixture of relief and authority, guiding James through the cockpit door. Every step toward it felt like stepping into a different world. Sterile panels, blinking lights, a maze of dials and screens that demanded complete attention. The flight crew's eyes met his briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible pressure about to descend upon him. James took a deep breath, feeling the pulse of responsibility surge through his veins. This wasn't training. This wasn't a simulation. This was life suspended at 30,000 feet, and he was suddenly the fulcrum on which it balanced. Inside the cockpit, the plane lurched violently. Alarms blared, urgent and unforgiving. James' hands instinctively found controls, his mind scanning the situation like a machine, yet tinged with the raw, human instinct of survival. He recognized the warnings immediately. hydraulic pressure dropping, turbulence exceeding safe parameters, minor system failures compounding each other. The cabin beyond the door would soon feel the effects of every decision he made here, every calculation and instinct. "Stay calm," he muttered under his breath, repeating the words as a mantra, knowing they were more for his own nervous heart than for the crew beside him. Voices crackled through the intercom, fragmented and tense. The captain's calm, authoritative instructions cut through the alarms. Adjustments, priorities, stabilization procedures. James responded, measuring each movement, each decision with a clarity that belied the chaos outside. Sweat ran down his forehead, soaking the collar of his shirt. Every fraction of a second mattered. Every subtle adjustment, a difference between catastrophe and survival. He thought of Lily, the image of her small face, the way she trusted him, the way she counted on him to keep her safe. That thought anchored him more firmly than any training ever could. Outside the cockpit windows, the night sky seemed to warp. The clouds a roiling mass under the glow of moonlight. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the trembling wings of the plane and the fragile, beautiful terror of it all. James felt both infinitesimal and immense at once. One man, one life, one chance to navigate a vessel carrying dozens of souls through the unpredictability of the storm. His mind raced, scanning memories of simulations, maneuvers, emergency drills, all coalescing into instinctive actions. The weight of responsibility was immense, but oddly, he felt more alive than he had in years. Clarity sharpening every nerve and sense. Back in the cabin, passengers clutched seats, whispered prayers, and held each other tightly. James could hear fragments of fear, a mother reassuring her child, someone muttering their own name as if repeating it could stave off disaster. He knew they were looking for control, for someone to hold the chaos at bay. Little did they know, behind the closed cockpit doors, a man was summoning every ounce of courage, every memory, and every skill to do exactly that. The realization that their lives rested in his hands was daunting, but he felt a strange sense of honor, a deep, almost spiritual commitment to protect these strangers as he would his own daughter. The turbulence reached a crescendo. Alarms merged into a relentless symphony of threat. James' knuckles whitened on the controls as he executed maneuvers with precision, voice steady, but heart racing. Each correction stabilized one system while testing another, a precarious balancing act that demanded both instinct and intellect. He reminded himself to breathe, to anchor each movement with thought, even as fear threatened to cloud judgment. Minutes stretched like hours, every second an eternity of tension, every heartbeat echoing with the stakes of life and death. Gradually, the plane responded. Systems that had faltered stabilized, wings ceased their violent sway, and the groaning of the engines lessened. The flight crew exhaled in relief, eyes wide, faces pale but composed. James' chest heaved, adrenaline ebbing slowly, leaving exhaustion and raw awareness in its place. The crisis wasn't fully over, but the immediate threat had passed. He allowed himself a brief glance at the cabin beyond the cockpit. Passengers' faces etched with fear, relief, gratitude, and disbelief. He imagined what they saw: how small his figure must look, a lone man standing between disaster and safety. He sank back into his seat, momentarily freed from the relentless grip of responsibility, and allowed himself a quiet, trembling sigh. He felt a mixture of triumph, humility, and the deep, unshakable pull of parental instinct. The night's events had reminded him of fragility, courage, and connection, of how life could pivot on a single decision in a single instant. And while relief was palpable, James knew the psychological residue would linger, the echoes of fear, the intensity of responsibility, and the vivid reminder of what it meant to truly be present for others, strangers or loved ones alike. As the plane stabilized and the storm passed into a distant, rolling murmur, James realized he had tapped into a part of himself he had almost forgotten, a balance of instinct, skill, and heart. He remembered Lily again, imagining her tiny hand, her trust, and the unspoken bond that made him willing to face any storm. The night was far from over, the journey ahead still long, but the crisis had forged clarity from fear, courage from exhaustion, and a deep, resonant awareness of the fragile beauty of life itself. James' hands hovered over the controls, the soft hum of the engines mingling with the faint buzz of warning lights. The turbulence had eased, but the plane was far from steady. His mind raced, a torrent of calculations, instincts, and memories flooding back from a life he had put aside. Each dial, each gauge, demanded attention, a puzzle of mechanics and physics that left no room for hesitation. He could feel the sweat on his brow, the tension in his shoulders, the rapid beat of his heart echoing in his ears. The cockpit was a world unto itself, a space where fear and focus collided, and where lives were suspended in every decision he made. Hydraulic pressures stabilizing, but engines are uneven, the captain said, voice taut, but controlled. James nodded, adjusting throttle and flaps with deliberate precision. Every action was a blend of muscle memory and instinct, the lessons of training entwined with the human desire to protect. He glanced at the small monitors, each flicker and blink a potential crisis or a fleeting reassurance. The plane responded to his commands, though imperfectly, swaying gently under his guidance. Memories of Lily filled him as he worked. He remembered her small hand slipping into his, the way she clung to him after nightmares, trusting him to be her anchor. That trust became a tether in this storm, grounding him even as the cabin rocked. I can do this, he whispered under his breath, a mantra against panic, a promise to the daughter he longed to hold. The thought of her waiting at home, unaware of the night's terror, fueled his focus, sharpened his every instinct. The crew around him moved with quiet efficiency, tension radiating, but controlled. They trusted him because they had no other choice, and James realized the weight of that trust. Each passenger's life depended not only on the plane's mechanics, but on his ability to summon skill and courage from memory and instinct. He could feel the collective heartbeat of the cabin through the floor and walls, a fragile, unspoken connection binding them together. One wrong move could shatter that fragile trust, and he couldn't let it happen. The plane jolted again, a violent shudder that sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins. James' hands reacted, before a thought could fully catch up, adjusting flaps and rudders, scanning instruments for warning signs. The alarm lights flashed in rhythm with his heartbeat, urgent and demanding. A sudden calm overtook him, almost meditative, as he synchronized action with instinct. The chaos outside faded into a background of sound and vibration, leaving only the clarity of responsibility and the immediacy of survival. Altitude is holding, but we need course correction, the captain said, leaning over the console. James nodded, executing maneuvers with precision, aware that even the smallest adjustments would ripple through the cabin. Outside, the clouds churned and swirled, illuminated intermittently by lightning that seemed impossibly distant, yet terrifyingly close. James felt a strange duality. The vastness of the sky contrasted sharply with the intimacy of the cockpit, the isolation and connection blending into a singular, vivid reality. He spoke to the crew in short, clipped sentences, voice steady though layered with underlying intensity. Every instruction, every observation was filtered through adrenaline and focus. Time seemed to stretch and compress, moments stretching into eternities and then vanishing in an instant. He felt exhaustion pressing at the edges of consciousness, but he pushed it aside, tethering himself to the task at hand. Each successful adjustment was a tiny victory, each stabilization a fragile hope against the backdrop of potential catastrophe. Flashbacks continued to weave through his concentration. He remembered training exercises that had seemed tedious at the time, simulations that now replayed vividly with real stakes. Each maneuver, each emergency drill, each lesson from instructors now had immediate relevance. He realized that his life as a single father, constantly balancing chaos and responsibility, had been preparing him in subtle ways for this moment. His awareness of risk, his ability to remain calm under pressure, his instinct to protect, these were not just skills, but lifelines. Suddenly, a sharp warning beep cut through the cockpit. James's heart leapt into his throat, but he forced calm, analyzing the problem with meticulous speed. The engines were uneven, one struggling under strain. He adjusted the throttle, monitoring the gauges as the plane responded. A tense moment passed, and then the systems began to stabilize. Relief flooded him, but he didn't allow himself to relax fully. The crisis wasn't over, and he knew every second required vigilance. "Good work," the captain said quietly, the words carrying a weight of sincerity. James exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in his body loosen just slightly. Yet, even as he allowed himself a brief acknowledgement of accomplishment, he remained acutely aware of the passengers behind the cockpit doors, their lives, their fear, their trust. He carried it all silently, an invisible mantle of responsibility that grounded him more firmly than any thought of personal safety. The plane began to smooth out, turbulence lessening to gentle sways. James felt the pulse of adrenaline slowly ebb, replaced by a deep, resonant fatigue that seeped into every muscle. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, closing his eyes briefly, imagining Lily's face, her small smile, her quiet trust. That image was both a comfort and a driving force, a reminder of why he couldn't falter, why he had to remain vigilant even as the danger passed. He thought of the stories he would tell her someday, The lessons embedded in fear and courage, in presence and responsibility. Minutes stretched into an uneasy calm. James scanned instruments again, making minor adjustments. Listening to the soft hum of the engines, the flight crew exchanged glances. Relief mingled with lingering tension etched into their features. James felt the shared human experience of fear and triumph. The intimate connection of lives intertwined in extraordinary circumstance. He realized that heroism wasn't about recognition or applause. It was about presence, about choosing to act when fear screamed to retreat, about protecting others even when it meant facing one's deepest anxieties. Finally, a long exhale, a subtle easing of tension. As the plane found relative stability, James allowed himself a faint, tired smile. The immediate danger had passed, but he knew the psychological imprint would linger. The adrenaline, the awareness of fragility, the stark, vivid reality of human connection under pressure. He leaned back, still alert, still aware, but permitted himself a brief moment of reflection. He had navigated the storm, held the line between fear and control, and emerged with the quiet knowledge that courage and responsibility were inseparable. Through the cockpit windows, the night sky stretched endlessly, vast and serene in contrast to the recent chaos. James felt a strange blend of exhaustion, relief, and renewed purpose. He thought again of Lily, imagining her tiny hands, her trust, her reliance on him. This experience had revealed more than technical skill. It had uncovered the depth of human resilience, the subtle courage of choosing presence over panic, love over fear. And though the flight was far from over, he knew he would carry these lessons, these echoes of intensity and care, with him forever. The landing gear extended with a low, mechanical groan, and James felt the plane's descent shift from tense anticipation to calculated relief. The storm had passed, leaving only a sky smeared with muted clouds and a soft glow of dawn beginning to push through. The cabin, once alive with fear and anxious murmurs, had settled into quiet, punctuated by deep, collective sighs of relief. Passengers remained seated, faces pale but softened with gratitude, hands lingering on armrests, as if afraid to let go of the fragile reassurance of life resumed. James kept his eyes forward, hands steady on the controls, yet his thoughts were already elsewhere, on Lily, on home, on the warmth of ordinary life he had been reminded to cherish through extraordinary circumstances. As the plane touched down, tires screeching softly against the runway, he felt a mixture of exhaustion and triumph surge through him. Relief mingled with adrenaline residue, leaving his body tense yet oddly light. The passengers erupted into muted applause, some clapping shakily, others whispering hurried thanks, relief dripping from every word and gesture. James allowed himself a small, tired smile, acknowledging the collective gratitude without letting it distract him. The real reward, he thought, was knowing every person on board would walk away unharmed, carrying stories of survival and human resilience. The plane slowed, engines humming down, and James finally allowed his shoulders to drop, tension easing like a river flowing from frozen banks. The crew exchanged quick words, a mixture of thanks and awe, and James nodded, appreciating their professionalism and bravery. They had trusted him, relied on him in ways that no one outside the cockpit could fully comprehend. He had not acted for recognition, yet the acknowledgement was a quiet balm, a subtle reminder that shared responsibility and trust could create miracles, even in the most impossible moments. As the cabin doors opened and the hum of activity from the airport filtered in, James' thoughts drifted immediately to Lily. He imagined her waiting, probably unaware of the night's terror, probably engrossed in a quiet routine she had established to occupy herself while he traveled. He felt a pang of longing, guilt, and hope all at once. He had missed so many ordinary moments, so many small milestones. But tonight's extraordinary ordeal had crystallized for him what mattered most: presence, connection, and the steadfast courage to protect those we love. He pictured kneeling beside her, holding her small hands in his, telling her that everything was okay, that he was there, and that nothing could sever the bond between them. Passengers began gathering belongings, faces still aged with residual tension. James watched them quietly, noting the lingering traces of fear and relief. Some exchanged quick words of thanks, others simply offered nods, eyes conveying what words could not. He understood these gestures, the subtle human language of shared experience, of lives touched and subtly transformed by a crisis that no one could have predicted. He felt a quiet pride, tempered by humility, that he had been able to act in a moment when skill and instinct intersected with the fragility of life. A young mother approached, eyes wide, her child holding her hand tightly. "Thank you," she said softly, voice thick with emotion. James nodded, feeling the weight of her gratitude, aware that it was not directed solely at him, but at the delicate thread of human survival woven that night. He replied with a quiet, simple acknowledgement, knowing words could never fully capture the enormity of what had occurred. Still, he felt the connection, the shared recognition of courage, vulnerability, and resilience. Outside, the sky had lightened further, the horizon hinting at a new day. James took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp morning air that carried the faint scent of tarmac and distant foliage. He felt the exhaustion settle into his bones, deep and thorough, yet alongside it was a clarity that only life-altering experiences could bring. He thought of the ordinary world awaiting him, of Lily's laughter, of the bedtime stories and whispered reassurances. And he knew that these moments, though small, were monumental in their own right. Tonight had reminded him of that truth, of the delicate interplay between fear and love, responsibility and connection. He walked slowly down the aisle, passengers moving around him, some casting curious glances, others looking away, lost in private reflection. James' gaze fell to the young boy who had clutched his mother's hand, face pale, but eyes wide with newfound awareness. He imagined telling Lily later about the courage that ordinary people could summon when faced with extraordinary circumstances, though simplified in terms she could understand. He wanted her to know that bravery wasn't always about grand gestures, but about showing up, choosing presence over fear, and embracing responsibility, even when it felt impossible. The crew filed past him, offering nods, brief smiles, and subtle acknowledgments. James returned each gesture, aware that these shared experiences had created invisible bonds, connections forged in crisis that would linger long after the immediate danger had passed. The passengers were leaving one by one, carrying fragments of the night with them, memory, relief, gratitude, and a reminder of human resilience. James let the scene wash over him, absorbing the textures of emotion, understanding, and the extraordinary grace of ordinary courage. Finally, James stepped off the plane, allowing himself a long, deep inhale. The airport was bright, bustling, yet for a moment it felt quiet, suspended between the chaos that had just ended and the ordinary routines waiting beyond. His thoughts returned to Lily, and he imagined her small face lighting up at his arrival. He could see her tiny arms stretching toward him, her trust and love palpable, even in imagination. He felt a deep sense of resolution, knowing that while the night had tested his limits, it had also reaffirmed the profound value of connection, courage, and parental devotion. In a quiet corner, James paused, reflecting on the storm, the adrenaline, and the delicate fragility of life. The experience had changed him, had carved out a new space in his understanding of responsibility and human courage. He realized that heroism wasn't measured in public accolades or headlines, but in quiet, deliberate acts of presence and care. He understood that his life, once consumed by routine and exhaustion, now held a renewed appreciation for the ordinary, for the small victories, and for the immense responsibility of love. He thought of telling Lily the story one day, carefully selecting words that would convey both the fear and the triumph, the ordinary and the extraordinary. But for now, the story was his alone, a memory seared with intensity, a quiet testament to human resilience. James took a step forward, carrying both the exhaustion of the night and the clarity it had brought. Every step was lighter now, guided by the knowledge that courage, love, and presence were inseparable, and that ordinary moments could hold extraordinary significance when seen through the lens of responsibility and care. As James walked toward the terminal, the sun broke through the clouds fully, bathing the world in warm, golden light. The day awaited, ordinary yet infused with meaning, a continuation of life enriched by the trials of the night. And in his mind, Lily's voice whispered, laughter mingling with hope, a reminder that even in the face of fear, the bonds of love endure, unshakable and resolute. James smiled, exhausted but whole, aware that the extraordinary events of the night would linger in memory, but also that life, with its quiet routines, awaited him. Every heartbeat, every small action, every moment of presence mattered. He had faced fear and emerged not just as a guardian of strangers, but as a father more deeply attuned to the fragile, beautiful intricacies of life itself. James finally stepped out into the soft morning light, the airport bustling around him, yet somehow the chaos felt distant, almost irrelevant. In his mind, he saw Lily's small face, her eyes bright with trust, her tiny hands reaching for him. Every fear, every heartbeat, every ounce of adrenaline from the night crystallized into one clear, undeniable truth. Love and presence mattered more than anything else. The night had tested him, pushed him to the edge, and reminded him that courage isn't just about facing storms in the sky. It's about showing up fully for those who rely on you in the quiet and ordinary moments of life. He imagined holding Lily close, whispering the story of the night in words she could understand, teaching her that bravery comes in many forms: standing up when fear threatens, protecting others even when exhausted, and never underestimating the power of small, deliberate acts of care. He smiled, feeling the weight of exhaustion paired with the lightness of perspective. Life could be fragile, unpredictable, and at times terrifying, but it was also beautiful, filled with connection, trust, and the bonds that hold us together. As he walked toward the exit, James carried with him a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet pride, and a deep awareness of what it truly meant to protect and love. The ordinary world, with all its routines and small joys, awaited him, but he now knew the extraordinary could appear at any moment, and that he was ready. Each step forward was a reminder that life, with all its uncertainties, was worth embracing fully. And as he imagined Lily running into his arms, he realized that every act of courage, every moment of presence, was a story in itself, one worth living, remembering, and sharing. In the end, the night wasn't just about survival. It was about awakening to the quiet heroism within each of us, the power of love, and the extraordinary impact of being fully present. And for James, for Lily, and for every life touched that night, the world had regained a little more of its warmth, its wonder, and its hope.